Copyright University of Auckland, all rights reserved. The content and delivery of lectures in this course are protected by copyright. Material belonging to others may have been used in these lectures and copied by and solely for the educational purposes of the university under license. You may record the lectures for the purposes of private study or research, but you may not sell, alter, or further reproduce or distribute any part of these lectures to any other person. Failure to comply with the terms of this warning may expose you to legal action for copyright infringement by the copyright owner and/or disciplinary action by the university.
Good, sounds good. So is this okay if I talk for the mic? It's all right? Okay, great. Yeah, so thanks, Josie, and thanks for inviting me along. It's really lovely to come to Auckland and actually share some of the research that we've been doing over the last few years. And also just to have a discussion about some of these things, because there's a huge amount of discussion and international debate about enabling local government to access risk information and risk data. And along with that have come some really massive statements from some international agencies that basically drive a lot of disaster risk reduction. So the World Bank, people who put a lot of money into this. And I think it's really important for us to learn from what we've been achieving here in New Zealand and from overseas, and every so often reflect on whether this is the right route to go down and whether this is going to work for us. So my talk today is framing around risk modeling tools, and the idea is discussing whether this is really useful and practical and some of the challenges and the benefits of having these tools, and drawing upon some of the changes that are happening at the moment in terms of the international disaster risk reduction sector. So I don't work alone by any means, which is really lovely, because when you're an academic or when you work in universities, you're often put in an office and you're very isolated. So working for NIWA, we have quite a big team. And in terms of RiskCAPE, it's always getting bigger, because RiskCAPE is a very big program. And some of you might know the tool, and that's just one section, and then there's a huge amount of hazards research that goes into that program as a whole. So I've just named a few people, and this is probably just the tip of the iceberg, who've been working with me recently. So Nick Horspool, who's a hazards researcher at GNS Science, worked very closely with him. And then more recently, bringing on board PhD students from a variety of universities who are interested in various topics, who can feed their information into that bigger program. So Alan has been working with us to develop social vulnerability indicators and looking at resilience as well for the program. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So just briefly, so you know where we're going today, talk about risk modeling tools. What are they? A bit of an introduction. We can have a little discussion about, the different tools that are out there. Who are they for and why do we need them? I think sometimes we take that whole question for granted. So it's really useful just to reflect on this and actually think about who are the users, what are they going to use these tools for, what are the practical things that we need to think about. And then some benefits, challenges, and I've got a few questions that I'd like to discuss with you guys at the end. So how many of you guys know about the Sendai framework? Mixed reviews. So the Sendai framework is something that you absolutely should know about if you work in disaster risk reduction or disaster risk management. So this is the new international framework for disaster risk reduction, which was agreed by over 150 countries, 106, sorry? 87? Okay, not as many as I thought, but a number of countries. Oh, 187, sorry. Good. 187 countries agreed and signed up to the Sendai framework in March this year. And this followed...
What if we don't agree? On a personal level or a philosophical level?
Absolutely, yeah, good question. And I think this is where I'm going with my talk as well. So you may not, the wording of the Sendai framework can be interpreted in many different ways. And I think it's up to us here in New Zealand, and New Zealand has signed up to this, to interpret what this means for us here in New Zealand. And how can we use the Sendai framework so that it's beneficial, but also use it as an advocacy tool as well. And there are certainly sections in the Sendai framework that really raise eyebrows. If you do have a look at the document, and I would recommend you have a look at the document, because this is going to be guiding disaster risk reduction for the next 30-odd years internationally. And potentially a lot of funding is going to be aligned with these sort of comments and statements that are in the framework. I would particularly, if you want to have a little giggle, have a look at the section that relates to roles and responsibilities, which is at the end of the document. Especially look at the media role and responsibility, which is a particular favourite of mine. But I won't go into all of that. There's been a huge amount of discussion and debate over many years, and the UN have really been driving this forwards. And it is an achievement to have a document that sets forwards a pathway for disaster risk reduction. And as Shane says, there are bits of it that are a little bit concerning, and there are certainly bits of the framework that you need to interpret. But I've just put a bit of it up here, and this is what it relates to the risk modelling tools. So the Sendai framework encourages us to enhance the development and dissemination of science-based methodologies and tools to record and share disaster losses, and to strengthen disaster risk modelling, assessment, mapping, monitoring, multi-hazard early warning systems. So already you can see from the language that this is one of those things where it's sort of everything for everyone. But it specifically talks about disaster risk modelling, which is interesting because if you look at the predecessor, the Hyogo framework for action, it doesn't go into this sort of technical language. It doesn't go into this sort of detail. So we're really starting to see a strong science-based element coming into these international policies, which is good for science. So I started to write out as really one of those PowerPointy titles where you start saying, international drive for disaster risk reduction with science-based. And I started writing it, and I started going, international drive for national and global risk modeling tools that are available to everyone at all scales, linked to national databases but owned locally, combining both traditional and local knowledge with scientific knowledge that are transparent. I had to take a breath at this point because I was really starting to lose it a little bit. They're also open access and open source, and yet reliable and robust. Blimey, take another breath, and used. So these big international policies and frameworks, when you read through them, there are big statements like this coming in. And already in what I've written here, which is summarizing some of the language and wording in some of these international policies, you can see that some of them just don't match. How can you have a national or international global database that's owned locally? How can you have tools that do everything for all people at all scales, local and international? You know, these statements actually, when you start looking at them in detail, although they're very much from a good place and they're encouraging these things to be taken on, they need that local interpretation, as Shane was saying. What if we don't want to have an international tool that we want local governments in the Hawke's Bay or Auckland to use? What if we don't want to share our sometimes sensitive data with the world and everyone in it? Oops. So we'll just bring us back to the sort of local level, the national level, if you like. So I don't know if many of you recognize this. Anyone recognize this? So these are a series of principles that are within the New Zealand Standard for Flood Risk Management. So there is a guideline for flood risk management in New Zealand, and you can get hold of it, I'm sure, through the University Library. And these are some principles that are put in place. So this is ideally what local governments should be following when they're doing flood risk management. Well, they should be using this as a guideline. It's not mandatory, but it's there to support local government, take them through step by step what they should be doing. And you'll see it's pretty logical. I would say the detail's missing a little bit, and that's left up to local government to interpret and put in the detail. But you'll see that it's, you know, first of all, you need to engage the communities and wider stakeholders, understand the natural systems and catchment processes, understand the interactions between the natural and the social systems, make decisions at the very local level, and I think in New Zealand that's done pretty well. All possible forms and level of management you have to take into account, data management, the management of the project, the governance, so that's where that falls in. And you mustn't forget about residual risk. So whatever you put in place, there's always potentially going to be a risk left over, which needs some thought put into it. And I think if anyone's been watching the Wanganui floods in June and following that story, you'll see that residual risk was something that perhaps they could have thought about a little bit more with the communities. So where I'm going with this is, why do we need risk modeling tools? So in order to really do a risk assessment, if you like, you need to have some ingredients. And this is very, very basic, but you need to understand the hazards, you need to understand their characteristics. And many local governments here in New Zealand have hazard models already. You also need to understand what's at risk, what's exposed, buildings, people, infrastructure. And then you need to understand sort of the value of those things. So maybe the social or economic information that goes along with the buildings, the infrastructure. So that you could basically estimate what is the likely impact if you have a big earthquake in Auckland. What are the economic losses you're likely to see? What are the social implications of this major disaster? So you need all of these ingredients. And you'll see that that was sort of, So that's sort of coming in at this number 2 and number 3 of your steps. So you're sort of pulling together all this information. Now, let me ask you, where would you get that information if you were a local government manager or officer in Auckland? Where would you access information relating to all of those things? Anyone got any thoughts? I know you were interviewed for a position recently with the council, so tell me, what would you do?
Well, you wouldn't just get from one source, you'd have to go to multiple different sources and look at like other stakeholders and operators.
Right, so if you were to do, you've got this project that you need to get off the ground, you need to do a risk assessment, you need to follow those steps. So you might get in a consultant who might do that for you. Because you might recognize that you don't have the skills or the resources or the capacity or time to actually do a risk assessment. So you bring in an external agency, maybe NIWA if it's flooding or someone else, and they produce a report for you. And sometimes those reports are a little untransparent, so you might not necessarily know where that information has come from. You might do if they're really good, but they might not. So you're receiving all this information, and you've got to make that decision. You've got to put together a report for your bosses around arguing a case for a new mitigation for something. Now, it's incredibly challenging to do that. If you're one person, you're really limited, you've got not much time. And there's all these different data sources out there and different people telling you different things as well. So the idea behind the risk modeling tool is essentially to provide a tool for local government where they have all that data and information at hand in one place, and that they can run a scenario themselves. So they can bring together the hazard models that exist for their region. They can bring together databases of buildings and people and all that asset information together. And they can put this into one tool which will provide them some results that they need. So whether that's an estimation of likely loss, if there was a flood in this area, or an estimation of how many people might be injured or killed. So that's in essence what a risk modeling tool that we know of is all about. And I say what we know of because there's lots of people who use the term risk modeling tools for various things. And it could almost be even mapping, or it could actually just be looking at vulnerability. So whenever someone says risk modeling tool to you, you need to sort of dig a bit deeper and find out what they actually mean. Because I've come across a lot of tools, and they can be all the way from a piece of paper that you use with community-based disaster risk reduction, mapping with the community all around you, all the way through to something quite technically advanced, which is a piece of software that brings together information. So why don't the local authority use, say, GIS or something like that to bring these layers together and make a decision? Now, 10 years ago, when RiskCAPE first started up, this wasn't really an option. If you think back 10 years ago, I'm not sure how many of us even were able to play around with GIS or have access to GIS software like ARC and things like that. And if you did, it was a very expensive license, and there aren't that many people who are technically trained to do complex calculations. So the idea of RiskCAPE was that we would be separate from these licensed softwares. So that's why it's standalone from ARC or QGIS, which is more recent. But even now, to use GIS, you still need a level of technical knowledge and know-how. And you need to understand how to interpret the results, and you need to understand how to develop functions. And I'll come on to that in a little bit. I'll introduce functions in a bit. So there are GIS platforms out there that you could use to do your risk analysis, your mapping, and produce something quite nice. But I would imagine it would take quite a bit of time, take quite a bit of coordination and training. You might even need a specialist GIS team within your local authority or your local council to support you in doing that. And it might be quite expensive to do that. Within a risk modeling tool, there are multiple calculations that go on behind the scenes. So you would have to do that upfront manually yourself in GIS. The other thing is, like I was saying, and like we were saying, there's lots of data all over the place. So we want one tool that brings all of this hazard and risk information together. So here you have a really simple outline of what RiskCAPE does. So you've got the hazard model. So we bring together hazard models, bring in, oh, the arrow's facing the wrong way. Flip that. Bring in the asset information, and you've got your function in the middle there, which I'll explain. And then ultimately, you want to get this scenario, this estimation of what might happen. So it explores the relationship between the hazards and the assets. And it tells you maybe where things might be exposed and what's the likely impact. This is just a bit more of a technical diagram of the other thing, and it breaks it down a little bit more. So we have hazard modules. We have vulnerability module, which is that function I was talking about. You have the asset modules, and you have the aggregation unit. So what spatial unit do you want the results in? Is it suburbs, mesh blocks, grids? And this all feeds into this risk model. And the outputs, as I said, are about exposure and loss. So this is the front screen. If anyone had to play around with RiskCAPE? One or two people. So if you've opened up RiskCAPE, you'll see something a bit like this. Now, it is going to change over the next few months because we've got a new release coming in December, which is looking a lot smarter. But you have basically got your interface, so you've got your mapping interface here, and you've got those sections there that I was talking about, your modules. So you've got your asset modules, your hazard modules, and what you want in terms of results. So currently, RiskCAPE can tell you some information about building damage. It can tell you how long people might be out of buildings, which is very useful for economic calculations. How long individuals be out of residential buildings, what the human losses and casualties are, and some of the reinstatement costs. So how much is it going to cost to put back that building, repair that building? And we want to include other things as well. But as researchers, as scientists based in Wellington, that's not really our job. It's not our job to say, oh, I think people really want to know about this. And this is where we have to engage with local authorities and users of the tool. So we need to ask them, what do you need as a result from this? Is it actually number of people killed, or is it something quite different? So going back to the data thing, currently, a lot of our work at NIWA and GNS is about developing these functions, developing these calculations that show the relationships between the hazard and the asset. But we're developing at the moment a new repository for this. And the idea behind that is instead of having default ones that everyone has to use, that the user has an option. And that they can actually go in and say, oh, I know there's a paper about damage functions for this from this country, and I want to use it. I don't want to use the default option. And it's all about giving people a bit more choice. The asset information, we have a national building database for New Zealand, which is amazing, because that's a huge thing, huge step, and not many countries have that. So the majority of our results use that, but it's not always as accurate as we'd like it to be. Some of that information has been modeled, some has been surveyed. So what we want to do is encourage local authorities to put their information into RiskCAPE as they collect it, so that they can use it. because ground truthing some of those information is really important, and there's always new data coming along. And an example of how important this is if you just simply look at Christchurch after the earthquake. So obviously the national building inventory for that region has completely changed since it was collected, I think, in 2010. And so now we're working with the City Council to start to survey and collect new information and update their building inventory as it develops, so that if they produce scenarios, then they're as accurate as we can get them. And then also, I mean, NIWA and GNS produce hazard models quite often, and we put those into the tool. But also local authorities do as well, and we have easy systems to get their information into the tool as well. So it's ideally a process that we want to encourage local authorities to put their information in to the tool. And I'll come back to the challenges of that in a second. So just to recap on these functions, this is some of the damage from the Wanganui floods in June. So for flood damage functions, NIWA staff collect as much empirical data as possible. So going out and measuring flood heights and looking at the damage that those floods have caused. And by doing that and examining that relationship, we can start to identify certain patterns. So certain flood heights have certain damage. And that's the information we use to develop our functions. And we apply and we test them using RiskCAPE. And we can test them using real examples such as Wanganui. And those functions, those scenarios, they can all be used, and they have been used in New Zealand. So we've done work with the town of Westport, looking at what sort of flood mitigation options might be the most cost benefit for that region. And they're currently using some of that original data to communicate to the public now and make decisions about what they want to do. Auckland asked GNS to do a survey around whether it would be useful to improve the strengthened buildings to a certain earthquake building code. Using some of the scenarios, they produced a report to help the council have a little extra information. And you can go on the Auckland Council website and download that report if you want to follow up. So these are practical things that we want to make as useful as possible. So just giving you a hand there, tell me who you think should use these tools. Try not to look at the slide that I've just put up. Or you can, and just tell me what I put up there. So who should be using these tools?
Anyone involved in disaster protection, disaster management, anyone that works with like infrastructure.
Anyone who works for infrastructure, it's quite a big group of people.
Or who would you trust to use these tools?
Right, exactly. So do you think private sector utility companies should be using this tool?
It's your lifeline in terms of for a disaster, so they obviously need to know the risk areas for where they're putting their infrastructure in comparison to other places.
Sure. So currently, actually, RiskCAPE isn't free for private sector. So it's free for local government and non-for-profit. Do you think that people who are putting some of their sensitive information into the tool will want private sector to access that information?
Depends on your overall aims, not your outcomes.
No. It depends. It depends. Probably not. And that's the problem we face. So although, of course, utility companies should be in this discussion, absolutely, they have a responsibility in terms of disaster risk management. But sharing some of these things with them is very difficult, and it's not up to us who design the tool, it's up to the local government how they use their data and who they share their data with. And so once you start thinking about who should use this and why and who are our users, this is a massive, massive question. And if you think back to that original statement that I put up on one of those first slides from the Sendai framework, risk management tools, open access, open data for all people to use at all scales, so that my grandma can use this. That's what they're saying. Oh, and also the person who's responsible for disaster management in her region. Is that realistic? I'm not entirely sure it is myself. But as Shane was saying, it's up to us to interpret what we can and can't do. And so one of the big challenges we're facing at the moment as the RiskCAPE team is it's not open source, it's not open access necessarily, because we don't necessarily own that data. And we have to work with the users that we have here and with the people who do own that data. But then we have the World Bank going, oh, but all tools need to be open access and open source. And so when we won't fund things like RiskCAPE because it's not open access, it's not open source. So there's always a challenge and a discussion to be had. And currently there's going to be a huge discussion going on over the next few years. And if anyone's interested, there's actually going to be a really interesting workshop or conference, I should say, in Istanbul called Understanding Risk. And this is the World Bank conference, and they focus on various different things. And they often focus around what they call big data, so data around risk. And that's going to be in March, I think, next year. I'm looking at JC. It's March, and they've just started to announce it, and they've just started to advertise it. So if anyone's got some spare money lying around, wants to go to Istanbul, might be quite an interesting conference. So this is the list we have for RiskCAPE. So this is who we think should be using RiskCAPE, or using the results from RiskCAPE. And even this list is so broad. And a land use planner will have completely different skills and needs from an emergency response officer. Civil defense will, again, have very different skills. So at the moment, we are doing a whole range of engagement with civil defense. We're going to be doing it from now for about a year to identify exactly what civil defense emergency responders in New Zealand need from this tool. And this is a sort of new approach for us. We sort of did group these people together, and because the tool was quite new for its time, we were sort of testing out what was needed and when. And now we really realize that we need to tailor a few of our things. So that's something that we're going to be doing. And if anyone's interested, I'm more than happy to chat to you guys about that afterwards. And then we have the international teams who are getting interested in risk modeling tools. So this was me. I'm not in that picture. I was taking that picture in Samoa last week, where we were having a project design workshop to see if we could develop a Pacific risk tool. So here are some team members from the National Disaster Management Office and from Land Use Planning Office in Samoa. And Nick, there you go, you can see his face now, from GNS there, and a colleague, Sean, from our Christchurch office. And even just having those two agencies coming together was so complex. And coming up with what they needed from a tool and when, and what was the time frame, was really challenging. But hopefully, if we work together, we can start to see these connections. And we can adapt the tool to their needs. So going back again to the World Bank statements and the Sendai framework, what is the difference between a user and a designer? This is really strange questions that I'm throwing at you today. Anyone want to have a go at telling me, what do you think a user should do, and what do you think a designer of a tool should do? Maybe it's too simple, maybe it's too obvious.
Why is that a teacher who did it?
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so JC completely saw through it. Is there a distinction between those two things? Should there be? Because at the moment, that's sort of what we have. We have risk modeling tools that are being developed maybe in research institutes, just like NIWA, or maybe elsewhere in research institutes or universities or sometimes governments, but often I see these things coming out of the research arena. And then the users are often the local government or the national government. Now, the idea that the Sendai framework and the World Bank want to put across is that the users should be central to this whole process. They should be driving the design of the tool, and that's absolutely correct. But first of all, we've already answered that question around who are the users. What is their capacity and knowledge? Are they really in a position that they can actually work and put time and effort and knowledge into this? Can we create a process to enable them to do that? What are their IT skills, their resources that they have? Can they engage? Can they be designers and users? Do they actually have the developer capacity? So one of the things was open source. What does open source mean to you guys? Anyone just give me an idea? Okay. Yeah, yeah.
I like to have a user as a designer in terms of ideas and having that sort of input rather than like technical capabilities. Because isn't that kind of like how most systems work, is that not one person can do it, it's like a whole range of jobs.
Absolutely, yeah. So so what we were doing in Samoa was setting up that process. So trying to get users to understand the tool and how it's used and what it could be used for, and then feed what they think into that process. But it's not quite so easy as it seems. Yeah.
Are you expecting too much? Are you expecting that there are individuals? I'm just going back to your Pacific example. Pacific Cities was an initiative developed by SOCAP to do precisely this kind of thing. Millions of dollars were spent on the assumption that people would want to use this tool. It's basically not used. Prior to Pacific Cities was Vanris in Vanuatu, an Australian aid project to develop precisely this kind of tool based on the assumption that people want to use it. People cherry picked to help design that, and then the implementation officers funded to run it and so on.
Yeah, yeah.
And it also died in a hole. So this whole RiskCAPE was developed at the time that Australian cities and Pacific cities were slowly going on the radar. And we're still facing this 10 years down the track. Are there actually a user community out there that we would want to use this tool? And would we even trust them if they did?
But isn't that around like building capacities of those countries? In terms of like working with it to show them how to use it and making it part of the process rather than just like a side tool?
There are generations of eager young people that were burned out by this.
Yeah, and often you'll see disaster risk reduction projects or ideas, if you like, going around in circles. So there'll be phases of different things that come through. And absolutely not denying that at all. And I think what we're trying to do in the Pacific is respond to a request for this. And so I think a lot of it is to do with timing. So like I said, 10 years ago, GIS, very cool, new, techie, oh, let's try that. But even the people who were designing these things didn't really know what they were doing. So, you know, there's been a lot of learning from the last 10 years around how we can best provide this sort of tool. And yeah, I think if Pacific Cities was a project that came in before RiskCAPE, so that's over 10 years ago now, I'm not surprised that it didn't go anywhere. Because even the guys who were probably trying to design that maybe didn't have as much knowledge as they needed to do it.
It went about as far as this one.
Sorry?
It went about as far as this one. But it was functional, it was implemented, people used it to model soon afterwards. It's pretty cool. Amazing worth spreading.
It's good to know. I'll have to look it up. Yeah, I mean, the projects, I think generally though in the last 10 years, disaster risk reduction has learned a huge amount. And linking to what Kate was saying about capacity building, so it's not just about delivering a tool, a piece of technology and walking away. It's about helping people to really understand how they can use it. And so we are going to engage, obviously, with the guys, and we already are, but we're probably also going to need to do some trainings before we even ask some of these questions. So they need to really fully understand what the tool can offer them and how they can interpret and use those results before they start designing. So all of these questions, if you're going to go on to work in this arena, or you're thinking of doing a project around this, these complexities in terms of engaging users and who are those users, and some of the things that might not seem immediately obvious will need to be considered. And also, you know, if you're going to be working in the local government in the future, you need to ask these people coming in, you know, what do you benefit from coming into the Pacific and working with us on this tool? You know, what's your agenda? What are you going to get out of it as well? And it has to be that partnership approach.
At least there's a positive side in the wording, which is that end users. Because end users really reflects a kind of top-down
And we're users as well. So we use the tool and we develop the tool. So users is a very blurry line. And I get a frustration. I mean, you might see the term end user. I might have slipped up and put it in there. But I get frustrated when I hear about end users as well. Because it does suggest there's a finality to it.
The funding agencies like the expression end users.
Yeah, that's true.
Characteristic of the process.
Yeah, top down. So we've sort of touched on some of these benefits, but hopefully the idea is that it's context specific, which goes against some of the stuff that we were seeing earlier. It's one source that you can go to. It's hopefully a simple interface. So not just your emergency responders, but maybe someone in land use planning who might not have that much knowledge about risk can go in and start to produce a scenario and start to understand those results coming out. And there is a danger there as well that Shane flagged. You know, who do we really want to have using this? As all of you in this room will know, interpreting results can be very much up to that individual about their experience and their background and where they've come from and how they want to use that information. I don't know if you've heard of the term, I think it's something like lying with statistics, or how to use statistics to, if you look, you know, so if I turn around and say to you, 80% of users of RiskCAPE find this tool really helpful, or it could be anything. That could be meaningless in many sense. So when you start getting these sort of results coming out, you need to have a really good foundation of trust with the person who's using that, as Shane was saying. But also, it can be interpreted in many different ways.
Can you see who owns the data in terms of who's and how it's being produced, if that makes sense?
So metadata?
Was that like in terms of like local councils putting in their own data?
Yeah.
Like national, is that you were putting in data? Do you
Yeah.
see who's...
Yeah, so if anyone puts in information into RiskCAPE, they absolutely have to fill out like the forms and templates around metadata, so that if anyone else goes and has a look at that, they know where it's come from. There's an additional step in that as well, which is around quality. So we have a very simple process where people can, when they put in information, they can say what sort of quality they think this information is. So if it's modeled and they're not 100% sure of the quality, then someone can go in and say, okay, well, we're using this, but the uncertainties are likely to be high.
Does it include as well sensitive social data, like incomes per household or disabilities and those kind of things?
Right, so at the moment, what we have in there is the deprivation index, but we don't use that for any calculations at the moment. It sits separately, so you can map it, but that's why we're working with Alan to sort of develop social vulnerability indices, or functions that might calculate those indices.
Is it household scale or?
The data is by building at the moment, but the exported data is aggregated because of the uncertainties. So you can't export building by building data at this point.
That was just going to be my question around uncertainty, because, I mean, it's amazing to get a single kind of end result, but considering there are so many different data sets with so many, are the impacts in terms of a range, or is there an error associated with it?
Yeah, absolutely. There's always going to be an error with any model that is produced. And
that's not communicated to the, I guess, if it's somebody in local government using it.
yeah. So currently, the information is stored on a technical wiki that is attached to the tool. And so that person can go and read about how that, like what model that is, where did it come from, who owns it, what's the quality, and they can, at this point, make their own judgment. But we don't think that's good enough at this point, I would say. So we would like to start thinking, and we're doing this at the moment as a team, is how can we communicate that uncertainty in better ways? So can we visualize it as part of the mapping process? Can it be produced alongside the results? So you can start seeing the error that you're working within. Now, this is a really challenging area of research, actually. Yeah. And so one of the things that we would, I imagine, like to do going forwards is working with universities more to try and come up with some of these solutions. And also leaning on those people who are doing work in this area. We can't be experts at everything. So You know, there are people who specialize in communicating uncertainties. So it might be quite nice to see what they're doing. But it's certainly on our radar, and it's something that we want to do. But at the moment, that communication of uncertainty is mainly in the technical reports. So it does require users to be able to go in, have time, and read those reports. And it's often, that's challenging in itself for people. So shall we just quickly have a look at some of these challenges? So collecting data. So where in New Zealand is the national database for hazards information? Where would you find that? In Wellington? Sean? Shane, even? Sorry.
Where would you find it?
Where would you find the national database for hazards information?
In the future.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it doesn't exist at the moment. I love my trick questions. You're going to hate me by the end of this. So data is stored all over the place, okay? Currently, and this is the same for many countries. Some local authorities have information, and they have hazard models and data. We have hazard models and data. GNS does. It's generally all over the place. One of the things the Sendai framework is arguing for is a national database, one place where you can go, one place where the data is stored. So collecting data itself is challenging, data that already exists and new data. So we go out, and here's Ryan, my colleague, measuring some flood water levels after the Wanganui floods in June. So we go out and we do as much as we can and collect empirical data post-event. But wouldn't it be wonderful if there was a system where we were all aligned using the same templates and all that information came into one place? I'm not sure that's even possible or realistic, but that's something that the Sendai framework's asking for. Are connected systems from collecting information all the way through to using that information. One of the things that in the Pacific seemed to be quite a big challenge was connecting data, like we do here, but even more so. So some of the guys working in the region weren't even able to connect remotely. So they'd have to run around with flash sticks. So during an emergency, someone would have to literally run down the road with a memory stick, pick up data they need, and run back to their office and put it in there. So those are the sort of challenges that these guys are facing on a day-to-day basis.
One quick question about this bullet and this picture. Has it been ever tried to actually ask the rovers to do that? Because it doesn't seem too technical to actually do that.
It's not my most technical photo, to be fair.
You challenge when you put forward the idea that skills may be lacking, or knowledge may be lacking in regards to IT. But this is not IT. People living there could actually take a meter and
Sure.
use you.
Yeah.
That hacks.
Absolutely. I guess.
And you partly hopefully solve the issue of ownership if people are actually involved in them. You know that.
Yeah. Well, citizen science and those sort of initiatives are certainly something that we could tap into. We don't at the moment. There are various issues, as you will know, around that. So quality, training, investment in getting that whole process up and running. And the IT side comes in around how do they share that information with us? How do they get that information to us? How can we check that quality and things like that? And providing them with adequate resources and templates to collect that information. But
This picture looks like high school science.
I'll tell Ryan.
Seriously, it could be a high school science class initiative.
It could be. But did you really want, I mean, what you don't see is we waded through mud up to here to get to that building. And we have to get permission from the owners. There's complexity in even just measuring that. I mean, that's obviously a very simple picture. But you wouldn't want high school kids wading through the Wanganui flood silt after that event. But yes, absolutely. For some things, there's potential, absolutely. Absolutely, and actually this is a really nice point. So some of the research that I did previously with Caritas as an NGO was looking at how you can use some of the community-based risk assessment information and feed that into these sort of tools. So when you need to map out vulnerability, where do you get that information? Who decides that that person is vulnerable and that person isn't? And the indicators that you use are the most appropriate. And of course, the answer is often you work with the community to come up with those things. So international NGOs all over the world carry out these community-based risk assessments. So can we use that information in a risk modeling tool such as RiskCAPE? And we did a little experiment, and we used actually a reinsurance tool called Impact on Demand by Aon Benfield. And they let us use it just for this little pilot, just to see if it was possible. And we took community-based data, and we interpreted that, and we produced functions, like I was talking about, based on that vulnerability data the community themselves had identified. And then we mapped that using the model and using maps for Cambodia, actually. So Cambodia. And it did work. It was a pilot, so we didn't get to the point of verifying that and going back to the communities. But there's definitely potential there, and that's a whole area of research that desperately needs doing, is around, how can we make the most of all these initiatives going on for useful enterprises. So hundreds and hundreds of community-based risk assessments go on every day all over the world. And that data tends to be quite isolated from a lot of this stuff going on. So how do we make that connection? So we've already touched on a few of these already, actually, which is great. I think this one is probably, for me, becoming one of the biggest challenges. So how do you ensure that in 10 years' time, that model is still working, is still used, just like Shane was saying? People haven't given up on it, but they're still being trained, new staff are coming in, and there's a continuous process of knowledge and training and education, and there's momentum and long-term momentum. And this is a huge challenge. I don't have the answer for this. I'm not sure many people would have the answer for this. And all we can do is make sure that we try and put in enough training, skills development, technical support, backing up their systems as possible, and learning from that process. Does anyone else have any other ideas? Because I am open to them at this point. And to stay relevant, exactly. So we have to incorporate new information, new science coming forward. It's always evolving. And this goes back to that idea of open source and ownership. So who is responsible for keeping that tool updated, and who should be training people? Who should be maintaining that data and checking the quality? And these are all big questions.
Do you integrate time? I mean, variation in day, night, seasons. We're doing some work in Fanjul at the moment, and how do we include the tourists, for example, in the picture?
Yeah.
Doing something for us.
So, yeah.
Day, night, and week, and season-based.
So we do day and night at the moment, but we would like to consider seasonality as well. And especially in some parts of New Zealand where you have a huge influx of tourists, in some areas it's really important. So those sort of, if you like, we see them as sort of slightly standalone projects. So we have our core work, and then ideas around how do you incorporate tourism, tourists, seasonality. These are things that we actually would encourage universities to work with us on. So if you have PhD students or master's students who are interested, then we're really keen to make those connections. Because we have to be realistic about what we can and can't do. But yeah, those are all, again, huge topics, areas.
And another one as well, which is that, I mean, the whole tool seems to focus on the negative dimensions of it, focusing on hazards and vulnerabilities. What about the benefits of these hazardous places? I mean, like the cost providing benefits in terms of well-being, the view, the landscape, and those things, and the capacities of those vulnerable.
Yeah.
Who are other people.
Absolutely. So we are looking into social vulnerability, but as you know, that's only part of the story. And there potentially, you could start looking at capacity indicators as well. So you could start mapping.
But that's still negative. I think what JC's getting at is a really interesting don't make a decision based on hazard or risk. They make a decision based on the amenity value of where they live or what they do. So the whole missing part of this equation is how would this information be integrated with all the other things that people do that motivate their decisions?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's broadening out that cost benefit to incorporating the qualitative and quality of life and all of those elements and livelihoods and things like that. And I think, ideally you would have a tool that could do that. But ultimately these tools are based on quantitative data. So you need to change that qualitative information into quantitative data that can be plugged into a tool like this. And potentially this is not the right tool for that. I would say that, you use these tools part of a whole suite of things. And I think you're absolutely right. No one should be making decisions purely based on cost benefit, based on estimated losses. It should also be balanced with what are the livelihood situations in that area? What is the quality of life? What do people want from living there? But it does come back down to risk perception. And as we know, that's a really challenging area. Do people really have the information at hand to make those decisions wisely? All good things. I feel like I should be taking notes and then giving out research projects to you all after this talk. Okay, so this is my final few slides. I'm sorry I've gone over, but just from me presenting what risk tools are, or this risk tool, I should say, you can really start to see that there's huge complexity. So I often see the tools as like an iceberg. So you can see the little bit at the top, and that's the bit that everyone gets really excited about and focused on or angry about, wherever you're coming from. And the software really, is just a tiny bit of this whole process. So what we've seen is it has to be accompanied by huge amounts of understanding around how you use the tool, trainings, and it has to be accompanied by all those mechanisms that enable the data to be used. So we have this software for New Zealand, we have RiskCAPE, but we don't yet have a national database necessarily for some of those hazards. We don't necessarily have the research knowledge around how you incorporate these qualitative elements. How do you incorporate community-based risk assessments into these tools? How do you incorporate elements of livelihoods? Making a decision that, something else needs to be done alongside this work. And so you can say what are the solutions, but I'm thinking the World Bank are already trying to find solutions to some of these without necessarily digging into the detail that we have just today. So in the documentation, just taking you right back to the beginning of the presentation, this is a report that recently came out from the World Bank and around risk modeling tools, giving us guidance around what should be happening. And this is a genuine quote that I haven't changed this. So it should be multidisciplinary, institutional, multi-sectoral, collaboration at all levels from international to community. So off you go and do that now. Now I think the idea behind this is obviously very good, but is it a bit of a wolf in sheep's clothing, okay? So when you start digging into it like we have today, these things just start to become meaningless. And that's the danger that we face, is that some of these things like the Sendai framework, these big documents coming out, they're coming from a reasonably good place and they're encouraging collaboration, which is great. But are they being unrealistic to the point where we start to back away and we start to not be able to even see how we go about trying to do this? So you'll see a lot of documentation. If you go away and read a lot of these things, you'll see big statements like this coming out more and more. This is another brilliant one from the Understanding Risk Forum that was in 2012. An enhanced risk model for the world, addressing the gaps in current knowledge, the risk patterns and trends, will be accurate and credible. Now, we've already had a discussion about quality and communicating uncertainty for the global DRR community. So these are huge statements, and these are the people, don't forget, these are the people who fund disaster risk reduction.
Would you say that these are people
Possibly. I wouldn't say that on tape. I don't know. No, but these, I mean, it is their job to put these statements out there and for us to interpret them. So they're not necessarily doing a bad thing, but it does become very challenging. It does become very challenging when you have to interpret these and apply them. So there's also one thing that keeps coming up time and time again, which is one tool to rule them all. So I've heard this a lot, and I know that HASIS, which is the US tool, they really want one tool for the whole world. And I imagine they might want it to be HASIS. It'll be fine. But I think even from our discussion today, we might start to see that there are different needs within the user base. There may well therefore be different tools that need to be developed. So having one tool that can do all of the things that we've discussed today is probably a little unrealistic. Well, at this point, maybe in time. So just reflecting on some of these big topics that are coming out. So context specific, we've seen how important that is. You know, can Westport really understand what their risk assessment is if they're using data sets from a global perspective? It needs to be locally owned, but who owns that data? The results need to be really high quality and usable, and you need to be able to stand up in the environment court and justify why you've made that decision. But there's always uncertainties with these scenarios. They have to be user-driven and design, and they need to be sustainable. And then there's all the stuff that we were talking about there, so new data coming in, evolving science, bringing in these new functions, these new functionalities. So I'm going to leave you with these questions, okay? These are the questions that we deal with all the time in the RiskCAPE team. You know, we're constantly discussing, reviewing, meeting, and trying to meet the needs of the local government here in New Zealand, and more overseas. Now, we hope that the tool will evolve to meet those needs, and then we hope that we're doing what we can. But we also need that collaboration, so we need to work with universities, and we'd really welcome that discussion, and we really want to collaborate with local authorities more and more. Without those guys driving it, then we're just developing a tool for who? I'm not sure.
Is it the Venn diagram at the back from Salomon?
Yes, it is. This is their stakeholders.
Is the distance in the center where the stakeholders match the needs of the locals?
No, it's not that clever.
I was thinking the researchers being far off and the government being far off.
You could interpret it that way. So this is the core team who are going to work with us on developing a tool. And then it goes further and further out who should be trained to an advanced level, and then the wider stakeholders. But thank you ever so much, and we really welcome any more questions or discussion. But it's been a pleasure talking to you about this today, and I'd really like to carry on the discussion. So please do email me if you want to, or we can have a chat.
Any further queries, comments, questions? Yeah, Marianne.
Do you see this tool as being more used in a long-term planning sense or in a crisis response type of context, and how do you deal with that?
So I think originally, and I'm sure if my colleagues from the RiskCAPE team were here, they could provide a bit more information. And Shane, you might know actually. But I think originally this tool, well, many risk modeling tools came from the insurance sector originally, the idea, if you like, so from catastrophe models. But of course, these are closed. They're owned by the insurance sector, and they don't let us use them. Aon let us use theirs for a very short period of time, and then sort of got all concerned that we might want to use it for a longer period of time. And so generally, I think the aim was economic losses. That was sort of where RiskCAPE started, and I think it really was aimed at the land use planners, I guess. But things have evolved rapidly, even just within disaster risk reduction thinking, and bringing in the qualitative elements, social elements, those sort of things. So this is why we're starting this program of a more in-depth engagement with the civil defense, because we've really seen that those guys can really see the use of this tool. They sort of pick it up really quickly and they're like, oh yeah, we could use this for our scenarios, or we could use this to map things out, we can use this for our planning. What we're sort of been talking about, and I think many people are talking about, is linking this to real time. So can you make RiskCAPE a real-time tool? I'm not sure if the answer is there yet. I mean, there was a lot of discussion in Samoa as well. So could you link this to maybe a library of scenarios that you've already got? So you have a warning coming in, it's going to be flooding, say, in Wanganui. You've already run the scenario for various different sizes of flood event. Could you therefore just pull that scenario out and help the civil defense guys with a little extra information? It could be more complex than that, I imagine, but that's sort of maybe a possibility in the future. So originally I think it was for land use planning, it was for long-term disaster risk reduction mitigation. But I think there's potential, there's a huge potential for civil defense to use this.
It's kind of really the benefit of the program that it is able to be like evolved and have that evolution that needs.
Yeah, it's definitely a benefit, and we see that as a huge benefit. But many local authorities don't see it that way. So constantly changing software is obviously really frustrating for some users. It's a balance, I think.
I've been picking on you, but
You have been cruel.
I feel as if I'm able to do so. Since I've known you since you were a bright-eyed young PhD student.
I'm still bright-eyed.
In the era of at that time, we were all Robert Chambers acolytes, and we're all whose reality counts and so on, the solutions in the community. And you seem to have sold out to the man.
Oh, no.
You have a tool in one hand, which you are going off to sell to the masses.
I would hope that's not the case at all. So I think what it is we've been talking to the guys in the Pacific for 2 years around going out there and using this.
I'm not just talking about them, I'm talking about
The world. Okay, so I think you have to be realistic. I think you can do a huge amount of good doing community-based disaster risk reduction, Robert Chambers, taking a step back, enabling the community to have a voice. But there's a balance. And, there's a huge amount of... After working for 3 years within an NGO that does this as its primary DRR work, I was working with a lot of communities who fundamentally didn't understand hazards. And they didn't understand, and then the staff I was working with didn't understand hazards. They had no necessary, and I didn't expect them to have a scientific background. But this was causing issues. So they were making decisions based entirely on the community perspective of what they had experienced or not experienced. And that basic sort of scientific risk assessment was severely lacking. And so there has to be that balance. But there's no reason why we can't develop a tool here in New Zealand without having that participatory approach. It can still be participatory. And I'm sure that there are many researchers who don't like doing that side of things. But I think we need to work towards developing these sorts of tools with people, in collaboration with people. And that's also how you can make change as well. So if you can work in a participatory manner with local governments and then help them understand that the community have a right and a voice within this process as well, then you're on the right track. But, there's always a balance to strike, and I think, it's a challenge. There's no easy solution. I think I would like to still think that I had the community and the participatory approaches at the heart of things still.
Who funded your project in Vanuatu? How did that come about?
So we are through to the first, so we're in the full proposal stage of MFAT funding. So we have got through the concept note stage, and it's partnership funds, so it's development funding. But we haven't got the money yet. Go on record. Sorry?
She's collecting data competition.
And so, I'll look into that.
Yeah, and if you want to come and chat to me about if you have an idea, if you're doing a research project, you want it to be connected, or you want it to be feeding in or useful in some way to the RiskCAPE program and to others, then please do come and have a chat, because we have a number of master's students working with us at the moment from Canterbury University and a few PhD students as well. And it's invaluable to have people who are fresh and bright-eyed working with us, and coming up with some really creative solutions to things that we're bashing our heads against.